Section 11 of the History and Literature of the Early Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Eric Hansen. The History and Literature of the Early Church by James Orr. Chapter 11. The Age of the Great Persecutions. Victory of Christianity continued. A.D. 250 to 324. Point 1. Establishment of Christianity. Constantine's later years. The Christians, not unnaturally, were as men that dreamed at the great revolution which had taken place in the state of their affairs. By one turn of the wheel they saw themselves raised from the lowest depths of abasement and suffering, and their religion placed on the throne of the empire. When, however, we speak of the establishment of Christianity by Constantine, we must beware of importing into that phrase the associations of modern alliances of church and state. On the one hand, the position of the church in its relation to the empire was very different from that held by the pagan religion. The old Roman religion was part of the state. It had no independent existence, no rights, no jurisdiction of its own. Its officers were state officials, and the emperor himself was Pontifex Maximus. In fact, the Roman state establishment was not abolished till the reign of the Emperor Gratian, near the end of the century, A.D. 382. The Christian Church was in quite a different position. It had grown up independently of the state, and possessed a vast organization of its own. It had its own office-bearers, its own laws, its own canons of discipline, its own councils, etc. It was an imperium in imperio, which the state did not create, but could only recognize. On the other hand, no formal alliance was entered into between church and state such as we are familiar with in modern times. The establishment of Christianity was not an act done at once, but grew up from a series of proclamations, letters, edicts, enactments, gifts, appeals and disputes, meetings of councils, etc., and only gradually took shape as time went on. The following are some of the chief heads. 1. There were proclamations of the emperor, publicly announcing himself a Christian, restoring their liberty to the Christians, ordering restitution of property, and recommending the Christian religion to his subjects. 2. The emperor encouraged everywhere the building and repairing of churches, contributing liberally from his own funds to the expenses. 3. He extended his Christian legislation and increased the privileges of the clergy. One important measure was the legalizing of the decisions of the church in civil disputes, where parties preferred to take their case before the bishops. Another was the conferring on the church the right to receive bequests. 4. The public acts of the state were purified from pagan associations and conformed to Christian principles. A law had already been established in A.D. 321 enforcing the civil observance of Sunday, Dies Sodis, to the extent of suspending all legal business and military exercises on that day. 5. The emperor exercised the authority which the church conceded to him of summoning councils for the settlement of doctrinal disputes, and otherwise took part in ecclesiastical affairs. The chief example of this was the summoning of the Great Council of Nicaea in A.D. 325 to decide the Arian controversy. 6. While Christianity was thus protected and privileged, paganism was tolerated, or suffered to dwindle away under the shadow of royal disfavor, except in special instances, where rites of a licentious character were forcibly suppressed. The above were no doubt substantial advantages to the Church. Yet through them, the Church was drawn into the sphere of earthly politics, and the ill-defined boundaries between civil and ecclesiastical jurisdiction led to the gravest evils. The victory of the Church in the state marks at the same time the beginning of an era of secularization and declension, from which monasticism was a species of reaction. It does not fall within the limits of this sketch to recount the later events of Constantine's reign. Even in this later period, it is just to acknowledge that Constantine is distinguished by many great and striking qualities. His life remains unstained by private vices. He maintained, with slight exception, the policy of toleration with which he set out. He took a sincere interest in the progress of the Christian cause, and labored to the best of his knowledge and ability for the peace and unity of the Church. Even the dark domestic tragedies of his life in AD 326 are too much wrapped in mystery to enable us to apportion fairly what measure of blame attaches to him. On the other hand, it is not difficult to see in him a growing elation and complacency in himself, as an instrument chosen by God to fulfill his purposes. A consciousness not sufficiently tempered by the feeling of personal unworthiness. With this tendency to self-elation went a strong dash of personal vanity and growing love of splendor, seen not only in the adornment of his person in robes of oriental sumptuousness, but in the gratification of expensive tastes in building. The most conspicuous example of this was the rearing of his new and splendid capital, Constantinople, dedicated AD 330. The lavish expenditure on this city and on the gorgeous establishment of his court involved him in the necessity of imposing heavy taxation on his subjects, so that his reign came to be regarded as despotic and oppressive. Even on the subject of his blameworthy self-exaltation, account should be taken of the temptations to which he was exposed, and of the extravagant adulation he received from the Christians around him. One of the most remarkable facts in his career is that while the patron of Christianity, the friend of bishops, judge of their controversies, president in their councils, a preacher and exhorter to Christian living, he himself did not receive baptism till the last days of his life, AD 337. We may, despite it all, find much in Constantine not unworthy of the great repute he has always had in the Church. Point 2. The Church outside the Empire. Manichaeism. The gospel, by the time now reached, had penetrated into many countries outside the bounds of the Roman Empire. There had long been Christians in Arabia. A Gothic bishop was present at the Council of Nicaea. Armenia, under Tiridates, at first a violent persecutor, had been persuaded to receive the gospel from Gregory the Illuminator about AD 302. Georgia received Christianity about AD 326. Persia, too, had large numbers of Christians, who were soon to undergo a fierce persecution. The gospel found its way into Ethiopia, Abyssinia, through two captive youths, Edesius and Frumentius, one of whom afterwards, under Athanasius, became the bishop of the Church. In connection with Persia, notice must be taken of the rise in the latter part of the 3rd century of the form of heresy known as Manichaeism. In general, Manichaeism is a mixture of Persian dualism with ideas borrowed from Christianity and Gnosticism. Its fantastic ideas might seem to put it beyond serious consideration, but it is to be remembered that it had fascination enough to enslave for 9 years even such an intellect as Augustine's, and that, despite persecution, it went on propagating itself for centuries, giving rise to sects in the Middle Ages, which were no small trouble to the ruling powers, Paulicians, Cathari, etc. The rise of Manichaeism was coincident with the accession of a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanidae, and of a great revival of Zoroastrianism. The founder of the sect, Mani, was a young and talented Persian who, under Sapor I, AD 240 to 72, conceived the idea of bringing about a fusion of the Zoroastrian and Christian religions. He had to flee, and in the course of extensive travels, India, etc., evolved his religious scheme into definite form. Returning to Persia on the death of Sapor, he met at first with a flattering reception, but finally he was denounced as a heretic and flayed alive. AD 277? The system is a piece of extravagant mythology from first to last. It starts with the dualistic conception of a kingdom of good, light, and a kingdom of evil, darkness. The kingdom of evil invades the kingdom of good, and bears off from it a portion of its light substance. It is these particles of light imprisoned in the chaotic elements of this lower world which give to the latter its mingled character. They suffer acutely, it is supposed, in being thus held in material bonds. The Manichaeans spoke of this as the crucifixion of the eternal Christ throughout creation. Creation, organization, is an expedient for their liberation. Man is created by the evil powers that the higher elements might be more securely bound. But the concentration aids, instead of retarding, the process of evolution. Redemption is through a higher power, the primeval man, identified with the spirit of the sun, or Mithras. The end of the development is the total separation of the light from the darkness. Mani formed a church with 2 grades of members. 1, the auditors, or outer circle, and 2, the elect, or sacerdotal caste, the perfect of the Manichaean sect. These did no work, but were maintained by the auditors. Augustine wrote elaborate refutations of the system. Point 3. Theology. The Monarchian heresies. As the 2nd century was the period of the Gnostic heresies, so the 3rd century is preeminently the period of what are known as the Monarchian heresies. We have reserved a brief connected account of these to the present point. They arose partly as a reaction against the doctrine of the Trinity, developed by the apologists and Old Catholic Fathers, which seemed to put in jeopardy the unity, monarchia, of God, and partly as a protest against the subordinationist doctrines of certain of the Fathers, which seemed to imperil the Christian interest of the true divinity of the Son. The simplest form of reaction against Trinitarian views is an Ebionitic, humanitarian, or purely Unitarian view of Christ. and this we find developing itself in the end of the 2nd century and beginning of the 3rd. Of Jewish Ebionitism we spoke in the 3rd chapter. In the Gentile Church, we have an early form of monarchianism in the Alogi, deniers of the Logos, an obscure sect of Asia Minor, about AD 170, who rejected the Gospel of St. John. At Rome, pure Unitarianism was represented in the Theodosians, under Victor and Zephyrinus, AD 190 to 218, and the Artemonites a few years later. Christ, in this view, was mere man. The Artemonites were replied to in a book called The Little Labyrinth by Caius, a Roman presbyter, who adduces against them the testimony of ancient hymns. More remarkable was the type of monarchianism produced by the Christological interest. Here, the aim was to make sure that in Christ, men had no secondary or derived being, but the absolute God. And this was thought to be secured only by the assertion that in Christ the Father himself had become incarnate and suffered. Hence the name Patripassians given to this party. The oldest representative of it we know of was Praxeas at Rome, about AD 177 to 90, against whom Tertullian wrote a treatise. Praxeas tried to explain that Christ, according to the flesh, was Son, but the divine element in him was the Father. He stayed himself upon the words, "I and my Father are one." John 10:30. Tertullian claims to have converted him. A more subtle form of the same doctrine was taught under succeeding episcopates by Noetus, about AD 200, and his disciple Cleomenes. Noetus affirmed the capacity in God of existing in different modes. As ingenerate, God was Father. As generate, he was Son. Hippolytus wrote against Noetus. Both Tertullian and Hippolytus accused the Roman bishops of the period of sympathy with this error. Origen, at a synod in Arabia, AD 244, had the satisfaction of recovering Beryllus of Bostra from a similar heresy. The defect of these theories was their failure to do justice to the Trinitarian distinction, plainly involved in the New Testament doctrine of God. This fault was met in the modalistic Trinitarianism of Sabellius, the most completely evolved and longest enduring of these monarchian heresies. Sabellius, a Libyan, is first met with in Rome under the episcopate of Zephyrinus, AD 202-18, as an adherent of Cleomenes. He was excommunicated by Callistus, himself a Patripassian. His heresy had a powerful revival in North Africa, about AD 260, and reappeared in the 4th century as a reaction against Arianism, Marcellus. In principle, its solution is the substitution of a trinity of revelation for a trinity of essence, a trinity of modes or aspects of the one divine being for a trinity of persons. The one God, monas, expands and contracts in successive revelations, as the arm may be outstretched and drawn back again. God revealed in the law is the Father. In Jesus Christ is the Son. In the indwelling in believers is the Spirit. The incarnation is thus a passing mode of God's manifestation. Pushed to its issue, it means nothing more than a dynamical presence of God in the soul of Christ. This yields the transition to the last phase of monarchian doctrine, namely the dynamical Unitarianism of Paul of Samosata, Bishop of Antioch, AD 260 to 70. Paul was a vain, ostentatious, theatrical man, of whom many discreditable things are related. He held, like the earlier Unitarians, that Christ was mere man, but affirmed a union of the divine logos, or reason, with Christ in a degree predicable of no other. Through this interpenetration by the divine power, Christ advances by progressive development till he becomes God, or is raised to divine rank. Deity here only means that Christ was deemed worthy for his peculiar excellence of divine honors, not that he became God in nature. It was apotheosis, deification by favor. Two influential synods were held at Antioch on the subject of Paul's heresy, AD 264 and 269, at the second of which he was condemned. He held, however, by his palace and dignities till forcibly expelled 3 years later, AD 272. Point 4. Church teachers and literature of the period. The church teachers of this period are not men of the mental stature of the great fathers of the previous age, but they are interesting characters, and took an active part in the church life of their day. Among the Greek writers, the chief interest centers in the school of Origen, the Alexandrian school, graced by such names of Dionysius of Alexandria, Gregory Thaumaturgus, Firmilian of Cappadocia, and Pamphilius of Caesarea. Dionysius of Alexandria has already been before us as a witness to the facts of the Decian persecution. He was a man of the utmost mildness and conciliatoriness of disposition, and on this account his advice and mediation were much sought after in the various disputes of the Church. He was born about AD 190 of wealthy parents, and in early life was brought to faith in Christ. He attached himself to Origen, was made presbyter in AD 233, became head of the catechetical school in Alexandria. In AD 247 or 248 was elected bishop. He suffered loss and exile in the Decian and Valerian persecutions, but returned at the peace under Gallienus. He died in AD 265. A good many fragments of his works and some of his letters remain to us. Not unlike Dionysius, in some respects was a second great pupil of Origen, Gregory Thaumaturgus, the Wonder Worker. Gregory's original name was Theodorus, and his surname was given on account of the repute he came to have as a miracle worker. The accounts of these miracles, however, are late. In a panegyric on Origen, delivered when leaving the school at Caesarea, he gives a full account of his life up to that time. He was born at Neo-Caesarea, in Pontus, about AD 210, of noble and wealthy parents. Led accidentally to Caesarea, in Palestine, he was arrested by the genius of Origen, and became his most devoted disciple. His soul became knit to Origen, as he says, like the soul of Jonathan to David. He remained with Origen 5 years, about AD 233 to 38. About AD 240, he became bishop of his native city, and had such success that at his death about AD 270, it is said there were only 17 pagans remaining. His evangelizing activity was incessant, but he erred in too great concession to pagan customs. Like all Origen's pupils, Gregory was a man of liberal, candid, cultured mind, actuated by a strong love of truth and of earnest and glowing piety. Several of his genuine writings remain to us. Firmilian, bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, was one of the most influential bishops of his time, but does not seem to have written much. Origen took refuge with him during the persecution of Maximin in AD 235. A letter to Cyprian denouncing Stephen of Rome is all we have from his pen. Mention must be made finally of a member of the school of Alexandria who did splendid service to the cause of sacred learning in the end of the 3rd century. Pamphilus of Caesarea, founder of the famous library in that city, and friend of Eusebius. Pamphilus was a native of Phoenicia, and, like the others named, came from a wealthy family. He studied at Alexandria under Pyrrhus, and there contracted an unbounded admiration for Origen. Removing to Caesarea, he devoted himself to the great task of his life, the collection and copying of manuscripts of the scriptures, of commentaries, and other works of value. The literary treasures thus amassed were of priceless worth, and furnished Eusebius with ample material for his literary undertakings. In the 5th year of the Diocletian persecution, Pamphilus was thrown into prison, and was finally martyred with 11 others in AD 309. He wrote in conjunction with Eusebius an elaborate work, The Defense of Origen. So intense was Eusebius's appreciation of this good man, the holy and blessed Pamphilus, as he calls him, that after his martyrdom, he adopted his name as part of his own. Origen, however, had also his opponents, of whom the principal was Methodius, bishop of Olympias, in Lycia, later of Tyre, who perished under Maximin about AD 311. We have from him a mystical dialogue in praise of virginity, the banquet of the 10 virgins. Only fragments remain of his attacks on Origen's views of creation, pre-existence, the resurrection, etc. It was formerly mentioned that the Alexandrian theologians were speculative, idealizing, platonizing, allegorizing in their tendency, liberal in their whole attitude to culture. Before the century closed, however, we note the beginnings of another school, the Antiochian, which was to have a long and influential history as the rival of the Alexandrian. This second school is marked from the commencement by a sober, matter-of-fact tendency, a preference of Aristotelianism to Platonism, and an adherence to a strictly grammatical and historical method of exegesis. Its founder was Lucian, who, like the heretical Bishop Paul, was a native of Samosata. Lucian himself fell under suspicion of unsound views, and was separated from the church during 3 episcopates. He was restored to the church, carried on his school with distinguished success, and finally crowned his career by a heroic martyrdom in AD 311 or 312. His method was predominatingly exegetical, and his style of exegesis was grammatical and literal. His school is the reputed fountainhead of the Arian heresy. Later, it had such distinguished representatives as Chrysostom, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and Theodoret. A creed attributed to Lucian was presented to a council of Antioch in AD 341. The Latin writers of this period may be more summarily alluded to. Commodian, about AD 250, wrote Instructions for Christian Living, and an apologetic poem against Jews and Gentiles, both in rude Latin hexameters. A little earlier, Julius Africanus died about AD 240. The first Christian chronographer had drawn up a work in 5 books, setting forth the course of sacred and profane history till the reign of Elagabalus. The 2 Latin writers who belong properly to our period are Arnobius and Lactantius, both apologists in the time of the Diocletian persecution. The Apology of Arnobius, a teacher of rhetoric against the nations, is in 7 books, and, as might be expected in a recent convert, is not very mature in Christian doctrine. It is, however, an able, learned, and convincing defense of the Christians from many of the objections brought against them, and an effective enough exposure of the folly of idolatry. Arnobius lays stress on the unique and well-attested character of Christ's miracles and the excellence of the Christian morality. Lactantius is reputed the most classical and elegant of all the Christian writers. His apologetic work, The Divine Institutes, in 7 books, was, in its finished form, dedicated to Constantine. He wrote also a book on the death of the persecutors, narrating the judgments of God on the persecutors of the Christians from Nero onwards. He died in old age, about AD 330. A last name to be noticed is that of the Greek writer and great church historian, Eusebius of Caesarea, who, though he belongs properly to the next age, yet begins his activity in this. He is indeed the link between the old and the new order. He was born probably about AD 260. His early associations are with Caesarea, of which city he became bishop about AD 315. He held this position to his death in AD 339 or 340. Eusebius was a man of extraordinary healing and industry, and his works form a little library of themselves. They are of all classes: historical, apologetic, exegetical, critical, doctrine, orations, etc. Reference need only be made here to his ecclesiastical history, extending from the birth of Christ to the defeat of Licinius in AD 323. His 2 apologetic works, the Evangelical Preparation, 15 books, and the Evangelical Demonstration, 20 books, 10 extant, his Chronicle, based on Julian Africanus, part in Jerome's translation, and his Life in Constantine, a panegyric rather than a biography, yet important for facts. The works of Eusebius are often desultory and ill-arranged. He has little independent merit as a theologian, and inclines to laxity of opinion. He plays the courtier with too much success to our pious emperor. Yet his writings are invaluable as sources of information, and for the extracts they preserve. In the use of authorities, he shows himself most accurate, painstaking, and faithful, a virtue of the first rank. Point 5. Points in Church Constitution and Worship. The chief matters requiring to be glanced at here may be gathered up under a few heads. 1. Church buildings. These became common in the course of the 3rd century, and were greatly multiplied after the victory of Constantine. The model usually followed was that of the Roman basilica. The basilica was a building of oblong shape, which served the double purpose of a hall of justice and place of concourse. The body of the building consisted of a central portion of nave and side aisles, one or more, separated off by pillars. At the upper end, in a semicircular recess, were the praetor's chair, the seats of the judges, and in front the altar, where incense was burned and oaths were taken. This form of building readily adapted itself to Christian purposes. The larger churches stood in a court or atrium, surrounded by colonnades. The doors opened into a vestibule, or narthex, which was as far as penitents were permitted to approach. The congregation assembled in the nave, or broad middle part of the church. At the upper end, a railed-off portion was reserved for the choir and inferior orders of clergy, the chancel, from cancellus, a railing. Here also, on one side, stood the pulpit, ambo. Finally, the semicircular part, apse, formed the special sanctuary. The praetor's seat became the bishop's throne. Around him sat the presbyters and deacons. The altar in front became the communion table, now also called altar, etc. In the more splendid churches, all the parts, doors, pillars, apse, and galleries, were finely adorned. In contradiction to later practice, the church was sometimes so placed that the rising sun might strike upon its front. So, at Tyre. 2. Development of church offices. In the 3rd century, church offices became greatly multiplied. The clergy were now divided into 2 groups. The greater orders, ordines majores, consisting of bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and the lesser orders, ordines minores, consisting of subdeacons, readers, acolytes, attendants on the bishop, exorcists, precentors, doorkeepers, catechists, etc. The distinction between clergy and laity was now firmly established. 3. Development of church service. If we may trust the oldest liturgies, that, e.g., in the so-called apostolical constitutions from 4th century, the church service had, by the end of the 3rd century, become highly liturgical and elaborate. The service was now divided into 2 parts. Catechumens, penitents, etc., being dismissed before the Eucharistic celebration began. The Eucharistic service itself was highly complex and ornate, including long prayers, responses, prescribed actions of the priest. The clergy had distinctive vestments. Festival days were now observed, especially Easter and Pentecost. The whole period between these feasts were apparently observed as a time of gladness. Music in the church was more highly developed. We have met with references to hymns, and there were now regular choristers and conductors. Baptism was generally connected with the above feast days, and certain rites had gradually become connected with the original ceremony, e.g. trine immersion, thrice dipping of head, the sign of the cross on the forehead and breast, giving the baptized person milk and honey, unction on the head, a white robe, etc. The practice of exorcism had also become part of the ritual. Shortly before baptism, the creed was imparted to the catechumen as a sort of password symbol. Baptism in grave cases of sickness was administered by sprinkling, clinical baptism. The discipline of the church was also made more elaborate. This followed from the prominence given to the idea of penance for the removal of post-baptismal sin. Penitents were now regularly classified into weepers, who prostrated themselves at church doors imploring restoration, hearers, who were allowed to hear the scripture lessons and sermon, kneelers, who were admitted to the prayers but in a kneeling posture, and standers, who were allowed to take part in the whole worship standing. The course of probation was often 3 or 4 years. 4. Development of church councils. Meetings of this kind sprang up informally in the latter half of the 2nd century. They were at first quite local, one bishop inviting other bishops and clergy to confer with him on matters of common concern, and their decisions had no binding force on other churches. In these early councils, presbyters and laymen took part as well as bishops. Latterly, only bishops appear to have voted. As councils assumed a more regular character, they came to be distinguished into different kinds. 1. There was the parochial council of the bishop and the clergy of his city. 2. There were provincial councils, attended by the clergy of a whole province. These were generally held in the metropolitan city, and the bishop of that city presided. 3. Tertullian speaks of councils of a whole region, regionis, national councils. 4. Finally, when the empire became Christian, and the emperor himself undertook the summoning of councils, there became possible councils of the whole church, ecumenical councils. The first of these was the Nicene, AD 325. In reality, these were almost exclusively Greek councils. The decrees of the councils were now compulsorily imposed by the emperors. As examples of councils may be mentioned, those in Asia Minor about the Montanus and Easter, those in North Africa on heretical baptism, those in Antioch about Paul of Samosata, the Council of Arles against the Donatists, the Council of Elvira in Spain, AD 306, etc. 5. Gradations of rank in the episcopate itself. These sprang from the meetings of councils and other causes in the state of the church. The bishops of the metropolitan cities soon attained from their position a higher rank than other bishops, and were known as metropolitans. The sanction of the metropolitan came ultimately to be necessary to the validity of the election of another bishop. This was followed in the 4th century by the elevation of the bishops of certain churches deemed worthy of special honor to the wider jurisdiction of patriarchs. Such churches were Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. to which Constantinople, as New Rome, and Jerusalem were subsequently added, 5 in all. This, however, carries us beyond our special limits. Our sketch has brought us to the triumph of Constantine and formal adoption of Christianity as the religion of the empire. Ere, however, this consummation was reached, the Arian controversy had broken out, AD 318, and the church was in flames from within, to the unconcealed delight of the pagan onlookers, and the intense chagrin of the emperor, who had hoped to find in this monotheistic faith a bond of peace in his dominions. The Nicene Council itself, AD 325, did little more than open new controversies, with which for half a century the world and church were filled. Narrow-minded imperial interference made matters ever worse. Over all the storms looms the noble figure of Athanasius, who appears already upon the scene before our period closes. To him, the Church owes nearly all its real guidance in the distractions of the age that follows. Athanasius contra mundum. On the verge of this new era, we cease our survey. Points for inquiry and study. Study Constantine's later career and contrast him with contemporaries. Read the fundamental epistle of Mani and other Manichaean expositions given in Augustine's works. Read the account of Paul of Samosata in Eusebius 7:30. Study more fully the contrast of the Alexandrian and Antiochian schools of theology. Read Gregory's panegyric on Origen. Read the so-called Liturgy of Clement in Apostolical Constitutions. Compare different theories of the origin of church buildings. See Lanciani, Pagan and Christian Rome. Books. Gibbon, Neander, and Presense on Manichaeism. Hatch's Organization of Early Churches. Farrar's Lives of Fathers. Compare Presense. Lanciani, as above. Brace's Gesta Christi. Church Histories on Theology and Worship. End of section 11. End of the History and Literature of the Early Church by James Orr.